Tel Aviv came under a two-direction cluster missile attack last night. The city was hit almost simultaneously from two separate fronts. Iran fired from the east, Hezbollah fired from the north. Both salvos were timed to converge over the city within minutes of each other, not one after the other. Not a first wave followed by a second wave that a damaged defensive network could track, sort, and engage in sequence. At the same time, from different vectors, with different weapon types, at different altitudes, on different trajectories, and that distinction matters. Because this was not just an attack designed to break through a shield. It was an attack designed to overload the logic of the shield itself, to force the fire control systems defending Tel Aviv into impossible decisions about which incoming tracks to prioritize, which threats to ignore, and where to send the remaining interceptors when there were no good options left. This was not volume alone, it was orchestration. The cluster missiles that reached the streets of Tel Aviv this evening came from both directions at once. And the people who were in those streets when the impacts arrived had approximately 40 seconds of warning from the moment the sirens activated to the moment the first warheads detonated. Not the 90 seconds the civil defense model requires, 40 seconds. Because the radar architecture that was supposed to detect the launches at the point of ignition and provide maximum warning time was destroyed in the first 3 days of this conflict, 40 seconds to get underground, in a city where shelter fatigue has been building for weeks. In a city where behavioral compliance with shelter guidance has been eroding because the sirens have been sounding so frequently that the warning has lost the urgency it carried in the first days. In a city where people were in the streets, in coffee shops and offices, in schools, doing the things that people do when they have been living under sustained missile attack long enough that some version of normal life has reasserted itself around the threat. The cluster missiles arrived in 40 seconds, and the joint operation that produced them is the most sophisticated, coordinated military strike against Tel Aviv that this conflict has produced. In the next few minutes, I will show you exactly how Iran and Hezbollah structured this joint strike, why the simultaneous two-direction cluster missile approach was specifically designed to defeat whatever defensive capacity remained over Tel Aviv, what the 4-0-second warning window means for the civilian population that was in the open when the missiles arrived, and what a coordinated Iran-Hezbollah joint strike on Tel Aviv tells you about the operational integration between the two forces, and what that integration means for how this conflict continues. Before we get into it, thanks for watching. Your support is what keeps this going, and I genuinely appreciate every one of you here. Make sure you are subscribed and like the video so more people can follow this. Now, let's get into it. To understand why the joint Iran-Hezbollah strike on Tel Aviv this evening is strategically different from every previous attack on the city, you need to understand what a coordinated two-direction strike achieves that a single-direction strike cannot. Every Iranian ballistic missile strike on Tel Aviv that preceded this evening has come from a single direction, from the east, from Iranian territory, along approach vectors that the degraded but surviving Israeli radar and air defense infrastructure has had time to orient toward. Even with the radar architecture partially destroyed, even with the interceptor stockpile depleted, even with the warning timeline shortened, the Israeli defensive response has been able to orient its remaining assets in the direction of the threat. When the threat comes from one direction, the fire control systems can concentrate whatever interceptors remain along the threat axis. When the threat comes from two directions simultaneously, the fire control systems cannot concentrate, they must distribute. And distributing already depleted interceptors across two simultaneous threat axes means that neither threat axis receives adequate defensive coverage. It means the interceptors that might have been sufficient to stop or reduce the Iranian salvo, if it had come alone, are insufficient when split between the Iranian salvo from the east and the Hezbollah salvo from the north. This is the specific military logic of the joint operation. Not to double the number of missiles arriving, but to force the defensive system to split its response in a way that makes both salvos more likely to get through than either would be on its own. That logic requires coordination, not just the coincidence of two separate operations happening at roughly the same time. It requires precise coordination of launch timing, trajectory selection, and arrival windows designed to produce simultaneous arrival over the target rather than sequential arrival that the defender can engage in order. The coordination that produced this evening's joint strike represents an operational integration between Iranian Aerospace Force launch planning and Hezbollah rocket and missile operations that is more sophisticated than anything these two forces have previously demonstrated in a combat operation against a single target. Iran has been supporting Hezbollah's missile capability for decades. The transfer of missile technology, guidance components, and operational knowledge from Iran to Hezbollah has been a central feature of the proxy relationship that makes Hezbollah militarily significant beyond the scale of its own indigenous production capability. But supporting a proxy force's capability and integrating that proxy force's operations into a precisely coordinated joint strike against a specific target at a specific time requires a level of operational coordination that goes beyond the supplier-recipient relationship. It requires real-time communication. It requires shared targeting data. It requires synchronized launch authority that allows both forces to launch within seconds of the timing that produces simultaneous arrival. The joint strike this evening demonstrated that all of those requirements have been met. The cluster missile configuration that both forces used in the strike is the specific weapon choice that deserves analysis because it tells you what the objective of the strike was beyond the immediate physical damage. A cluster missile disperses multiple submunitions over a spread area rather than concentrating a single warhead's energy at a single impact point. The tactical logic of cluster munitions against an urban civilian area is that the submunition dispersal pattern covers a geographic area significantly larger than a single warhead could affect. The psychological logic of cluster munitions against a civilian population is different and more insidious. Cluster munitions produce submunitions that do not all detonate immediately. Some submunitions detonate on impact. Some do not. The submunitions that do not detonate immediately become unexploded ordnance. They sit in streets, in gardens, on rooftops, and in debris piles. They are difficult to identify. They are sensitive to disturbance, and they continue posing a lethal risk to anyone who approaches them hours, days, and weeks after the strike that dispersed them. A city that has absorbed cluster missile strikes is not a city that returns to normal movement patterns immediately after the all-clear sounds. It is a city where every street, every open space, and every debris pile is a potential unexploded ordnance site until it has been cleared by specialist teams. The clearance takes time. In the conditions that exist in Tel Aviv right now, with emergency services already stretched across the accumulated demands of weeks of sustained missile strikes, with the Rafael factory destroyed, and the interceptor stockpile depleted, and the power grid damaged, and the water infrastructure compromised, the capacity to rapidly deploy specialist unexploded ordnance clearance teams across the geographic spread of a cluster missile strike is significantly lower than it would be in a city that had not already absorbed everything this conflict has produced. Iran and Hezbollah chose cluster munitions for this joint strike specifically because they understood that dynamic. The cluster missile strike is not just a weapon that produces immediate casualties. It is a weapon that produces a post-strike hazard environment that degrades the city's ability to return to normal function for weeks after the strike itself. Now, let us talk about the 4-0-second warning window, because this is where the human consequences of this morning's strike are most urgent and most inadequately communicated by official reporting. The civil defense model that Israel has operated throughout this conflict is built around a 9-0-second warning window, 90 seconds from the moment the siren activates to the moment the first warhead arrives. In 90 seconds, a person who is awake, alert, and physically capable can reach an accessible shelter and be inside it before impact. That 9-0-second window was designed around the detection capability of the radar architecture that Iran destroyed in the first 3 days of this conflict. The radar architecture that detected Iranian launches at the point of ignition and transmitted that detection to the warning system with enough lead time to produce 90 seconds of siren to impact. Without that radar architecture, the detection happens later in the flight path. The later the detection happens, the shorter the warning window. The warning window over Tel Aviv this morning was approximately 40 seconds. The Israeli civil defense infrastructure across Tel Aviv is not uniformly distributed. The apartment buildings in some districts have well-maintained reinforced rooms or basement shelters that can be reached from any apartment in under 30 seconds. The older building stock in other districts has shelters that require exiting the apartment, descending multiple floors, and entering a basement facility. That sequence takes longer than 30 seconds for most residents. The public spaces, the streets, the coffee shops, the markets, or the outdoor areas where people have been trying to maintain some version of normal life during this conflict have no immediate shelter access. 40 seconds to reach underground for a person in a coffee shop in central Tel Aviv means leaving the shop, finding the nearest shelter entrance, navigating to it, and being inside before the warheads arrive. That is not possible for most people in most situations in 40 seconds, and the cluster missiles arrived in 40 seconds. The official statement from the Israeli military describing this morning's strike confirmed impacts in multiple districts of Tel Aviv and stated that casualties are being assessed. The being assessed language is the same language that has preceded every official casualty figure in this conflict that has subsequently been revised upward when the full accounting became available. The 4-0 second warning window, combined with the cluster missile dispersal pattern, combined with the behavioral erosion of shelter compliance that has been developing over weeks of sustained alerts, is producing a casualty picture that the being assessed language is managing, not describing. Managing the Hezbollah dimension of this strike requires specific analysis because it changes the operational picture of this conflict in a way that extends beyond the immediate damage to Tel Aviv. Hezbollah has been firing rockets into northern Israel throughout this conflict. There has been a persistent second pressure that has forced Israel to maintain defensive attention and interceptor allocation toward the north, while the primary Iranian missile campaign has been coming from the east. But participating in a precisely coordinated joint operation targeting Tel Aviv, specifically with cluster missiles launched from Lebanon, timed to arrive simultaneously with Iranian missiles from the east, represents a significant escalation of Hezbollah's operational role in this conflict. It is not a Northern Front operation anymore. It is a coordinated participant in a joint strike against Israel's largest city. The political and military consequences of Hezbollah crossing that threshold are operating simultaneously in multiple directions. For Israel, the joint strike demonstrates that the security architecture it has been attempting to maintain through the Northern Front, while focusing its primary defensive attention on the Iranian ballistic missile threat from the east, is insufficient. The Northern Front and the Eastern Front have merged into a single coordinated threat that the depleted defensive architecture over Tel Aviv cannot adequately address from either direction simultaneously. For Lebanon, Hezbollah's participation in a joint strike on Tel Aviv creates political and military exposure for the Lebanese state that the Lebanese government did not authorize and cannot easily manage. Israel has historically held the Lebanese state responsible for attacks launched from Lebanese territory, regardless of whether those attacks were conducted by Hezbollah rather than by the Lebanese armed forces. The joint strike on Tel Aviv from Lebanese territory creates the conditions for an Israeli military response targeting Lebanon that goes beyond the Northern Front operations that have characterized Israel's response to Hezbollah throughout this conflict. For Iran, the joint strike demonstrates that the proxy relationship with Hezbollah has matured to the point where a precisely coordinated joint operation targeting a specific city at a specific time with synchronized launch authority is achievable. That operational maturity has implications beyond this specific strike and this specific conflict. It tells every government watching that Iranian proxy management has reached a level of operational integration that makes combined arms operations across multiple theaters feasible in ways that were previously theoretical. The strategic and political consequences of the joint strike are compounding. Everything else the Netanyahu government is managing in the most difficult period of this conflict. 5 uncontested Tel Aviv strikes, 2 Jerusalem strikes, the dual city simultaneous strike, the Haj Qassem combat debut in Deir ez-Zor, the Dimona strikes, the IDF headquarters strike, the Diego Garcia strike, the power grid destruction, the water infrastructure attacks, and now a precisely coordinated joint Iran-Hezbollah cluster missile strike on Tel Aviv with a 4-0 second warning window. Each of those events has added to the political weight, pressing down on a government that started this conflict, promising quick and decisive action. The joint strike has added to it at a moment when the political foundation under that government is at its weakest point since February 28th. And the open question that this morning's coordinated strike leaves is not just about Tel Aviv, it is about the operational integration between Iran and Hezbollah that the strike has demonstrated. If Iran and Hezbollah can coordinate a joint cluster missile attack on Tel Aviv with synchronized launch authority and simultaneous arrival, what else can they coordinate? What other targets are within the combined reach of a joint operation that uses Iranian ballistic missiles from the east and Hezbollah missiles from the north simultaneously? Jerusalem is within range of both. Dimona is within range of both. The remaining IDF command infrastructure is within range of both. And the coordination that produced this morning's joint strike does not disappear when this specific strike is over. It is a demonstrated capability that can be applied to the next target that both forces assess would benefit from the same simultaneous two-direction approach. Thanks for watching. I appreciate you being here. Drop your thoughts in the comments. If the joint Iran-Hezbollah cluster missile strike demonstrates that the operational integration between the two forces has matured to the point where precisely synchronized joint operations targeting a specific city at a specific time are achievable, what does that demonstrated coordination capability mean for every other target in Israel that sits within the combined reach of Iranian missiles from the east and Hezbollah missiles from the north? And at what point does a defensive architecture that is already depleted from the east have to acknowledge that it cannot simultaneously address a coordinated threat from two directions with the interceptors it has remaining? Let me know below. Subscribe and like the video if you want to stay updated on this, and click the video on screen to see another one. I will see you soon.